Thunder rolled across the vast Wyoming sky as Katherine Cole clutched her mother's journal to her chest, watching through the cracked window of her isolated cabin as black storm clouds gathered on the horizon. It was 1879, 3 months since she'd buried her mother, and the young schoolteacher's decision to remain in the remote settlement of Panamint instead of returning east now seemed foolhardy as the wind began to howl like a wounded animal. The first drops of rain hit the roof like bullets as Catherine Katie, to those who knew her, rushed to secure the shutters. At 22, she'd grown up in Boston's comfort before following her widowed mother west when consumption took her father. Now, with both parents gone, the small cabin her mother had purchased with the last of their savings was all she had left. "This won't hold," she muttered, eyeing the sagging corner of the roof where water already dripped steadily onto her mother's old quilt. The cabin had been neglected by its previous owner, and despite Katie's efforts to maintain it, the structure protested against each gust of wind. Miles away, Garrett Blackwell rode hard toward shelter, his stallion Midnight struggling against the muddy trail. At 30, the cowboy had seen his share of Wyoming storms, but this one promised to be particularly vicious. The cattle drive he'd been leading had dispersed when lightning struck too close, and he'd sent his men to the nearest ranch while he headed toward Panamint to alert the townsfolk. His tan duster whipped around him as rain lashed his face. Garrett pulled his hat lower, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. Through the gray curtain of rain, he spotted a small cabin, smoke still curling from its chimney despite the downpour. "Come on, boy," he urged Midnight forward. Just a little farther. As Katie placed the last pot to catch a new leak, a thunderous pounding at her door startled her so badly she nearly toppled from the chair she stood on. "Hello? Anybody home?" A deep voice called over the storm's roar. Katie hesitated, her father's old shotgun leaning in the corner catching her eye. Lone women didn't survive the frontier by opening doors to strangers, but turning away someone in this weather felt equally dangerous. "Who's there?" she called, moving toward the gun. "Name's Garrett Blackwell, madam. I was heading to Panamint when the storm caught me. My horse needs shelter, and I could use some myself if you can spare it." Katie grabbed the shotgun before unlatching the door, holding it pointed downward but ready. The door flew open with a gust of wind, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Rain plastered his duster to broad shoulders, and water streamed from the brim of his hat. "I mean no harm," he said, hands raised slightly when he spotted the shotgun. Behind him, a magnificent black horse stamped nervously. Lightning cracked, illuminating a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in its ruggedness. His eyes, Katie noted with surprise, were a startling shade of green unexpected in his tanned face. "There's a lean-to around back for your horse," she said finally, stepping aside. "Hurry before we both drown." Garrett nodded gratefully. "I'll see to Midnight first, then if you'll still have me." "I'll put on coffee," she replied, not entirely certain of her decision but unwilling to condemn man or beast to the storm's fury. While Garrett led his horse around back, Katie added wood to the fire and set water to boil. She placed the shotgun back in the corner but within easy reach. Her mother would have cautioned against allowing a strange man into their home, but her mother had also believed in Christian charity. Besides, Katie reasoned, she'd survived scarlet fever as a child, and her mother's slow death from pneumonia last winter. Surely she could handle one cowboy. When Garrett returned, he was drenched to the skin despite his duster. He removed his hat at the door, revealing dark hair that curled when wet. "I'm obliged, miss." He left the question hanging. "Katherine Cole. Most call me Katie." She handed him a towel, careful to keep distance between them. The coffee will be ready soon. You can hang your coat by the fire. Miss Cole. He nodded respectfully while removing his duster. Beneath it, his clothes were relatively dry, a worn blue shirt tucked into faded denims held up by suspenders. A gun belt hung at his hip, which he unbuckled and placed carefully on the table after meeting her eyes for permission. "Bad storm brewing," he commented, moving to the fire. "Haven't seen one like this in some time." "Is it common?" Katie asked, retrieving cups from her small cupboard. "I've only been in Wyoming a year." Garrett studied her more carefully then. Her accent wasn't Western, and her dress, though practical, had once been fine. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple knot, but wisps had escaped to frame a face too delicate for frontier life. "Easterner?" he asked. "Boston," she confirmed, pouring coffee. "My mother and I came west after my father died. She passed this winter." Compassion flickered across his face. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." A particularly violent gust rattled the cabin, and water began to drip through a new spot in the ceiling. Katie sighed, moving to place another pot beneath the leak. "Roof's seen better days," Garrett observed, accepting the coffee she offered. "Everything has seen better days," Katie replied with unexpected candor. "Mother bought this place with the last of our money. The previous owner failed to mention its quirks." Garrett's reply was interrupted by a tremendous crack as lightning struck nearby. The cabin shuddered, and a section of the roof over the small bedroom gave way with a groan. "Lord have mercy," Katie whispered as rain poured through the new gap. Garrett set down his cup immediately. "You have a ladder." "Outside against the side," she answered, grabbing empty buckets. "I'll take a look." He was already pulling his duster back on. "Mr. Blackwell, you can't go out there now, Garrett," he corrected, settling his hat. "And that hole will only get bigger if we don't do something." Before Katie could argue further, he was out the door, battling the wind. She hurried to move her most precious possessions away from the growing puddles: her mother's journal, her father's pocket watch, the family Bible. Minutes later, Garrett returned, soaked but determined. "The whole southeast corner is failing. Got any extra lumber? Nails?" "There's some in the lean-to my mother bought for repairs." Garrett nodded. "I'll need help. Can you handle yourself on a ladder?" Katie straightened. "I taught myself to fix the shutters. I can manage." For the next hour, they worked together against the storm's fury, Garrett making emergency repairs while Katie held the ladder and passed tools. Despite their efforts, the wind continued to tear at the fragile repairs, and rain found new paths through the weathered boards. Finally, as darkness fell completely, Garrett climbed down, rain streaming from his hat brim. "We're fighting a losing battle. This roof won't hold through the night." As if confirming his assessment, a tremendous gust tore away their recent work, creating a gaping hole above Katie's bedroom. "My mother's quilt," Katie cried, rushing inside. Garrett followed, finding her struggling to pull a sodden patchwork quilt from beneath debris. Together they salvaged it and retreated to the main room, which was now their last refuge as water poured freely through the bedroom. "What now?" Katie asked, shivering despite the fire. Her dress was soaked, her hair plastered to her face. Garrett assessed the main room. "The center beam is still holding, if we can reinforce it." He looked around for materials. Another section of roof groaned ominously. Katie stared up in dismay as boards began to separate, the nails pulling free inch by inch. "It's going to go," Garrett said grimly, grabbing the table and upending it. "What are you doing?" Katie asked, confused. "Making a support." He positioned the sturdy oak table beneath the weakening section of roof and climbed onto it. "Hand me those blankets." Katie rushed to comply, watching as he stuffed the blankets into the widening gaps, trying to block the worst of the rain. A deafening crack split the air as the wind found purchase in the damaged roof. Boards splintered, and the entire section began to tear away. "Get back!" Garrett shouted, pushing Katie toward the corner where the structure seemed strongest. The storm tore the roof apart with a sound like thunder, opening the cabin to the full fury of the elements. Rain poured in as Garrett leapt onto the table again, his powerful arms braced against the remaining beams. "Mr. Blackwell," Katie called out in horror. "Come away from there." The wind howled through the gaping hole, threatening to tear away what remained of their shelter. Garrett's muscles strained as he pushed against a beam that was starting to give way. "Then I'll hold it together with my body," the cowboy said through gritted teeth, his green eyes meeting hers with steely determination. "Get whatever you can't lose and be ready to run for the lean-to if I tell you." Katie stood frozen for a moment, watching this stranger risk himself for her home for her. Then she sprang into action, gathering her mother's journal and the few valuables she'd already saved, stuffing them into a satchel. For hours that felt like days, Garrett held his position, occasionally shifting to reinforce a different section as the storm battered what remained of the roof. Katie worked alongside him, passing him ropes and strips of fabric torn from old bedsheets to lash down loose boards. When his arms trembled with exhaustion, she climbed up beside him despite his protests, adding her strength to his. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met," he muttered when she refused to leave his side. "And you're the stubbornest man," she retorted, rain mingling with tears of determination on her cheeks. Something shifted between them in those desperate hours, respect blooming in the face of shared danger, admiration for each other's resilience. By the time dawn broke and the storm finally began to abate, they had salvaged half the roof through sheer will and ingenuity. Garrett finally climbed down from the table, his body trembling with exhaustion. Katie helped him to the lone chair that hadn't been repurposed for their desperate defense. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. He looked up at her, rain and sweat having carved clean trails through the dust on his face. "Your home is still standing, Miss Cole. That's what matters." "Katie," she corrected gently. "After what we've been through, I think you've earned the right to my Christian name." A smile touched his lips, transforming his weary face. "Katie it is, then." She realized she was still holding his arm and stepped back, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Her dress was torn in places, her hair had come completely undone, and she was soaked to the skin. "I'll see if I can salvage enough dry wood for a fire," she said, turning away. "You should rest." "We both should," he agreed. "But first let me check on Midnight." When he returned from the lean-to, Katie had managed to coax a small fire from damp kindling. Garrett's horse had weathered the storm well, protected by the sturdy structure that had ironically fared better than the main cabin. "He's a fine animal," Katie commented as Garrett warmed his hands by the fire. "Been with me 5 years, Garrett replied. "Best partner a man could ask for out here." "And what brings you to Panamint?" she asked, wringing water from her hair. "Cattle drive." "I was heading to town to send a telegram to the buyers." He studied the damage around them. "But I reckon that can wait." "Your roof can't." Katie shook her head. "I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." He met her eyes steadily. "Unless you've got someone else coming to help." The question hung between them. They both knew the answer. Since her mother's death, Katie had been largely alone. The townspeople were kind but distant, still viewing her as an outsider despite her position teaching their children. "No," she admitted finally. "There's no one." Garrett nodded once, decision made. "Then I'll ride into town for supplies once the trails dry a bit. We'll need proper lumber, nails, tar paper." "I don't have much money," Katie said quietly. "Teaching doesn't pay generously." "I've got money," he replied simply. "Been saving for land of my own someday. This seems a worthy use for some of it." Katie wanted to refuse, pride warring with practicality. But the reality of her situation was inescapable without help. She would lose the cabin and with it, her last connection to her mother. "I'll pay you back," she said finally. Somehow, Garrett's expression softened. "Let's just get your roof fixed before the next storm. We can settle accounts after." They spent the morning salvaging what they could, moving Katie's belongings away from the damaged sections and covering the gaping holes with oilcloth Garrett found in the lean-to. By midday, the sun had emerged, beginning to dry the sodden earth. "I'll head to town now," Garrett said, saddling midnight. "Should be back before dark." Katie handed him a small bundle. "It's not much, just biscuits I made yesterday. They're a bit damp now, but—" "Thank you." He tucked them into his saddlebag, touched by the gesture. "Bar the door while I'm gone. Storm like that tends to drive critters looking for shelter." After he'd ridden away, Katie surveyed her battered home with new eyes. For the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't facing disaster alone. The strange cowboy with the green eyes had quite literally held her world together when it was falling apart. She touched the beam he'd braced with his body, wondering what kind of man would do such a thing for a stranger. In Boston, men had called on her with flowers and pretty compliments. None had ever shown the kind of raw courage and selflessness she'd witnessed last night. True to his word, Garrett returned before sunset, his horse loaded with supplies. To Katie's surprise, he wasn't alone. 3 men rode with him, each leading pack horses laden with lumber and tools. "Miss Cole," Garrett called as he dismounted, "these are some of my drovers, Jim Preston, Hank Miller, and Tobias Washington. Boys, this is Miss Katherine Cole." The men tipped their hats respectfully. Katie recognized Tobias as one of the few black cowboys in the territory, known for his skill with horses. "Mr. Blackwell told us about your predicament, madam," Jim said, a weathered man in his 40s. "Thought we might lend a hand." "That's very kind," Katie replied, overwhelmed by their generosity. "Wasn't a request," Garrett said to his men, already unloading supplies. "Was an order." The men laughed, clearly used to their boss's direct manner. "Would have come anyway," Hank, the youngest, assured Katie. "Can't have a lady sleeping under open sky." For the next 3 days, the men worked from dawn until dusk, rebuilding Katie's roof stronger than it had been before. Garrett supervised every detail, occasionally sending Tobias to town for additional materials. Katie cooked for them, stretching her meager supplies to feed hungry men, and listened to their stories around the fire each evening. She learned that Garrett had come to Wyoming after the war, having fought for the Union despite being from Virginia originally. He'd worked his way up from ranch hand to foreman, and now ran cattle drives for the Henderson Ranch, saving every penny toward his dream of his own spread. "Why Wyoming?" she asked him on the 3rd evening as they sat on her newly built porch while the others played cards inside. Garrett gazed at the mountains silhouetted against the setting sun. "Space to breathe, room to build something that's mine alone." He glanced at her. "Not so different from why you stayed, I suspect." Katie nodded slowly. "Mother loved it here. Said the air helped her breathe better after Father died. When she passed, I couldn't bear to leave her behind." "Roots grow deep quick out here," Garrett observed. "Gets in your blood." "Does it? I still feel like an outsider sometimes." "That'll change. Takes time is all." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, stars emerging in breathtaking profusion above them. "I've never seen so many," Katie murmured, gazing upward. "In Boston, the city lights hide most of them." "One of my favorite things about the open country," Garrett replied. "Man can see where he stands in the universe out here." The next morning, the roof was complete solid pine shingles laid over fresh beams and sealed with tar. The men had even reinforced the walls and fixed the broken shutters. Katie's cabin looked better than it had since she'd arrived in Panamint. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said as they prepared to leave. She'd used the last of her flour to bake pies, which the men accepted gratefully. "No thanks needed, madam," Jim assured her, already mounted. "Been a nice break from pushing cattle." Hank and Tobias nodded their agreement before riding out, leaving Garrett lingering on her porch. "The drive will reach Casper in about a week," he said, hat in hands. "I'll be coming back this way after." Katie felt a flutter in her chest at his words. "The school term starts next Monday." "I'll be teaching then. Might be I could call on you, properly like." His gaze was steady, but she detected a hint of uncertainty. "I think I'd like that very much, Mr. Blackwell." "Garrett," he reminded her with a smile that transformed his serious face. "Garrett," she repeated, liking the way his name felt. He replaced his hat and mounted Midnight in one fluid motion. "A week, then." Katie watched him ride away, realizing with startling clarity that she was already counting the days until his return. The man who had held her roof together with his body had somehow begun to repair something else that had been broken: her heart. The following Monday, Katie stood before her classroom of 20 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Panamint wasn't large enough to warrant separate classes by age, so she taught them all together in the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. "Good morning, children," she greeted them, smoothing her best dress, a navy blue affair with white trim that she'd carefully pressed the night before. "Good morning, Miss Cole," they chorused with varying degrees of enthusiasm. As she began the day's lessons, Katie found her mind occasionally drifting to Garrett. Had the cattle drive reached Casper yet? Was he already on his way back? The thought both excited and terrified her. During those intense days repairing her cabin, something had blossomed between them, something fragile and undefined. "Miss Cole," a small voice broke into her thoughts. 8-year-old Lucy Henderson tugged at her sleeve. "You asked me to read, but you're looking out the window." Katie flushed, embarrassed to be caught daydreaming. "I'm sorry, Lucy. Please continue." That evening, as Katie walked home from school, she was surprised to find Sheriff Thomas Wallace waiting on her porch. "Evening, Miss Cole," the sheriff greeted her, rising from the chair Garrett had built. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Sheriff," she replied, though she wondered at his presence. "Is everything all right, Sheriff Wallace?" A man in his 50s with iron gray hair and a perpetually worried expression shifted uncomfortably. "Got a telegram today I thought you should know about." There was some trouble with the Henderson drive. Katie's heart seemed to stop. "Trouble? Rustlers hit them north of Douglas. There was shooting." "Garrett," Katie whispered, her hand flying to her throat. He's alive," the sheriff assured her quickly, "but he took a bullet. They've got him at the doctor's in Douglas." Relief warred with renewed anxiety. "How bad is it?" Telegram didn't say much. Just that he was wounded defending the herd and asked someone to let the schoolteacher in Panamint know he'd be delayed. Even wounded, he'd thought to send word to her. Katie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff." After the sheriff left, Katie paced her cabin, the cabin Garrett had saved. The thought of him lying wounded, perhaps alone except for a strange doctor, was unbearable. But what could she do? Douglas was nearly 100 miles away, and she had no horse, no wagon. She was still wrestling with her thoughts when a knock came at her door the next evening. Katie opened it to find Lucy Henderson and her mother, Martha, standing on her porch. "Mrs. Henderson," Katie greeted them, surprised. "Lucy, please come in." Martha Henderson was a handsome woman in her 30s, wife to the owner of the Henderson Ranch where Garrett worked. She rarely came to town, managing the household while her husband handled business matters. "Miss Cole," Martha said without preamble, "I understand you've formed an attachment to our foreman, Mr. Blackwell." Katie flushed. "He was very kind during the storm. He saved my home." Martha's expression softened. "That sounds like Garrett, always putting others before himself." She gestured to the chairs. "May we sit? I have a proposition for you." Once seated, Martha continued. "My husband has gone to Douglas to see about the cattle and check on Garrett. I'm taking the buckboard tomorrow to bring Garrett back to the ranch to recover." "I thought you might wish to accompany me." Katie's heart leapt. "You'd let me come?" "From what I hear, he'd rest better knowing you're well," Martha said with a knowing smile. "Besides, the journey is long and I'd welcome the company." "But my students—" "I've already spoken with Reverend Phillips. He's willing to mind the school for a few days. His wife was a teacher back east before they came west." Katie was overwhelmed by the woman's thoughtfulness. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be ready at dawn," Martha replied simply. "And pack for a few days' stay at the ranch. The roads are still muddy in places. We won't rush the return journey with an injured man." That night, Katie barely slept, alternating between worry for Garrett and preparation for the journey. She packed her mother's medical kit, remembering the herbal remedies her mother had learned from a Shoshone woman during their first winter. The journey to Douglas took 2 long days, with an overnight stay at a way station. Martha proved to be excellent company, sharing stories of her 20 years in Wyoming territory that helped Katie better understand the land that was now her home. "It's not an easy life," Martha admitted as they watched the sun set from the way station's porch. "But there's a freedom here you won't find back east. A woman can be more than just someone's wife or daughter." "Is that why you came west?" Katie asked. Martha nodded. "My father wanted me to marry a banker in Philadelphia. I wanted adventure." She smiled at a private memory. "I found Robert instead, half dead from a knife wound after a bar fight, nursed him back to health, and he proposed the day he could stand without help." "That's romantic," Katie said, thinking of Garrett holding up her roof. "Romantic," Martha laughed. "Child, it was the most practical decision I ever made. I needed protection in wild country. He needed someone who wouldn't faint at the sight of blood." Her expression softened. "The love came later, growing stronger with each hardship we weathered together." Her words stayed with Katie as they continued to Douglas the next day. Was that what she felt for Garrett? Something born of shared adversity that might grow into love? Or was she merely grateful to her rescuer? They reached Douglas by mid-afternoon, the small town bustling with activity from the recent cattle sales. Martha directed the buckboard to the doctor's house, a tidy white building on the town's main street. Katie's heart pounded as they were shown into a small recovery room where Garrett lay, his normally tanned face pale against the white pillows. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged and his eyes were closed. "Garrett," Martha called softly. His eyes opened, focusing first on Martha, then moving to Katie. Something flickered in their green depths, surprise, then unmistakable joy. "Katie," he whispered, his voice rough. "You came." She moved to his bedside, fighting the urge to take his hand. "Of course I came." "You promised to call on me, remember?" A ghost of his smile appeared. "Might be a bit delayed in keeping that promise." "Mr. Blackwell was fortunate," the doctor said, entering behind them. "The bullet passed clean through his shoulder, no bones shattered, no major vessels severed. With rest and care, he should make a full recovery." "When can he travel?" Martha asked practically. "Tomorrow, if you take it slow," the doctor advised. "Keep the wound clean and watch for fever." That evening, while Martha met with her husband to discuss the cattle business, Katie sat with Garrett. At first, Conversation was awkward, both of them suddenly shy after the intensity of their previous time together. "You didn't have to come all this way," Garrett said finally, watching her adjust his pillows. "I wanted to," Katie replied simply. "You helped me when I needed it most. Did you think I wouldn't do the same?" His expression softened. "Most women I've known wouldn't travel 100 miles to see a man they've barely met. Perhaps I'm not most women." She paused, gathering courage. "And perhaps you're not just any man." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to express fully. Garrett reached for her hand with his uninjured arm, his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller ones. "No," he agreed softly. "You're definitely not most women, Katherine Cole." The journey back to the Henderson ranch took 3 days, with frequent stops to ensure Garrett's comfort. By the time they arrived at the sprawling ranch house nestled in a protected valley, Katie and Garrett had shared more of their histories, filling in the gaps of their knowledge about each other. She learned about his childhood in Virginia, his estrangement from his family when he chose the Union, and his wandering years after the war before finding purpose in the West. He listened as she described her sheltered upbringing in Boston, her brief engagement to a banker's son that ended when her father died, and her mother's desperate hope that the Western air would cure her lingering illness. "She loved it here," Katie said as they sat on the ranch house porch on their 3rd evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Said she felt truly alive for the first time." "And you?" Garrett asked, his arm now supported by a sling but healing well. "Do you feel alive here?" Katie considered the question seriously. "I didn't at first. I was too busy helping Mother than grieving her, but lately." She met his eyes. "Yes, I believe I do." Robert Henderson, a burly man with a booming voice but gentle manner, had welcomed Katie warmly to his home. "Any friend of Garrett's is welcome here," he declared. "Man saved my herd and took a bullet doing it. Least I can do is host his lady friend." Katie had blushed at the designation but hadn't corrected him. What was she to Garrett exactly? Friend seemed inadequate for the connection they'd forged, yet anything more remained undefined. On their 5th day at the ranch, Garrett was strong enough to walk the property, showing Katie his favorite spots: the creek where trout jumped in spring, the aspen grove that turned golden in fall, the high meadow where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. "It's beautiful," Katie said as they rested on a fallen log overlooking the valley. "I can see why you want land of your own." "Been saving for 3 years," he replied. "Another 2 and I should have enough for a decent start." "What kind of ranch do you want?" "Nothing too big. Manageable by a man and his family, with maybe a hand or 2. He gave her a sidelong glance. "Would need a good woman, though. Ranch doesn't run itself." Katie's heart quickened at the implied question. "I imagine the right woman would find great satisfaction in building something lasting. Even if it meant hard work, isolation, winters that can kill the unprepared, the best things often require sacrifice," she replied softly. "As my mother used to say, diamonds don't form without pressure." Garrett smiled. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Katie paused. "She would have liked you." "High praise indeed." He reached for her hand. "Katie, when I'm healed, I'd like to court you properly, calling at your cabin, taking you to church socials, the whole business, if you'll allow it." Katie turned to face him fully, her heart in her eyes. "I'd like nothing better." 2 days later, Katie returned to Panamint with Martha, who needed supplies from town. Garrett remained at the ranch to continue healing, but the parting felt temporary rather than final. He would come to town in another week. They agreed, well enough by then to begin their courtship in earnest. Life resumed its rhythms for Katie, teaching during the day, grading papers and planning lessons in the evenings. But now there was an anticipation that colored everything. making even routine tasks seem brighter somehow. Word had spread through Panamint about Garrett's heroism during both the storm at Katie's cabin and the Rustler attack. When he finally rode into town the following Sunday, many townspeople greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and thanking him for protecting the Henderson herd, which represented a significant portion of the local economy. Katie watched from the church steps as he navigated the well-wishers, his eyes seeking and finding hers across the crowd. When he finally reached her, he removed his hat, revealing hair freshly cut for the occasion. "Miss Cole," he greeted her formally, aware of the watching eyes. "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to dinner at the hotel this evening?" "I would be delighted, Mr. Blackwell," she replied with equal formality, though her eyes danced with private amusement. That evening began their official courtship, conducted with all the propriety the small town expected. Garrett called at her cabin 3 evenings a week, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered on the trail, once a length of pretty blue ribbon that matched her eyes. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the hotel restaurant, and walked along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. All perfectly respectable activities that gave them time to learn each other's minds and hearts. Beneath the propriety, however, burned a deeper connection. When their hands brushed while walking, electricity seemed to pass between them. Their conversations ranged from philosophical discussions about faith and purpose to practical matters of ranch management and education. "I never thought I'd meet a man who actually wanted to hear my opinions," Katie confessed one evening as they sat on her porch. "Why wouldn't I?" Garrett seemed genuinely puzzled. "You've got a fine mind, better educated than most out here, man or woman." In Boston, young ladies were expected to have opinions only on household management and fashion. Garrett snorted. "Waste of good brains, if you ask me. Out here, a woman needs to think quick and decide quicker sometimes. Life or death doesn't care about social niceties." As autumn approached, their feelings deepened into something neither could deny. One crisp September evening, as they walked back to her cabin after a town social, Garrett stopped beneath a massive cottonwood tree. "Katie," he said, taking both her hands in his, "I'm not a man of fancy words. But I know my own mind, and I've come to know my heart." He took a deep breath. "I love you. Have since that night we held your roof together through the storm. Maybe even from the first moment I saw you, shotgun in hand but still willing to offer shelter to a stranger." Katie's eyes filled with tears. "Garrett, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it hasn't been long by some standards, but out here we learn to recognize true value when we find it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "This was my grandmother's. I sent for it weeks ago." Inside the box was a simple gold band set with a small diamond, nothing ostentatious but beautiful in its elegance. "Katherine Cole, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, building a life and a home and a future together?" Katie looked from the ring to the man holding it, this man who had literally held her world together when it was falling apart. The answer was as clear as the stars now appearing above them. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Garrett Blackwell, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he cupped her face gently and lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss, tender at first, then deepening as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to build you a home so strong no storm will ever threaten it again. As long as you're there to hold it together if it does," she replied softly. "I'll face any weather gladly." They were married 2 weeks later in Panamint's small church, with the entire town in attendance. Martha Henderson had helped Katie refashion her mother's wedding dress, and Garrett wore a new suit purchased in Casper. Robert Henderson stood as Garrett's best man, while Martha attended Katie. "Never seen a man more besotted," Robert commented during the small reception at the hotel. "Known Garrett 5 years, and never once saw him look at a woman the way he looks at you." "The feeling is mutual," Katie assured him, watching as her new husband accepted congratulations from the townspeople who had become her community. That night, as Garrett carried her across the threshold of her cabin, their cabin, for now Katie felt a sense of rightness that transcended her nervousness about the wedding night. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwell," Garrett said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "It feels different," she observed, looking around the familiar space, "knowing it's ours together, even temporarily." "Everything feels different," he agreed, his voice deepening as he drew her closer. "Katie, I know you might be nervous," she silenced him with a kiss, finding courage in the love shining in his eyes. "I'm not afraid, not with you." Their wedding night was a revelation, tender, passionate, and transformative. Garrett's gentleness with her inexperience made Katie love him even more. And as they learned each other's bodies as thoroughly as they'd come to know each other's minds and hearts, she felt the final pieces of their bond lock into place. Later, lying in his arms as moonlight filtered through the window, Katie traced the scar on his shoulder from the rustler's bullet. "I nearly lost you before I truly found you," she murmured. Garrett caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Takes more than a bullet to keep me from what matters." "And I matter?" she asked, a hint of the insecurity that had shadowed her since her parents' death slipping through. His arms tightened around her. "Katie, you matter more than anything. More than land, more than cattle, more than my own life. Never doubt that." Through the fall and winter, they lived in Katie's cabin while Garrett continued working for the Hendersons, saving every penny. Katie continued teaching, now wearing her gold band proudly. The townspeople adjusted quickly to addressing her as Mrs. Blackwell, seeming to approve wholeheartedly of the match. By early spring, Garrett had found the land he wanted: 500 acres with a year-round creek, good grazing, and timber for building. It was located 20 miles from Panamint, far enough for privacy but close enough that Katie could potentially continue teaching if she wished. "It's perfect," Katie declared when he first showed it to her, the land still dormant with winter but promising renewal. "When can we start building?" "Robert's given me 2 months off to get started," Garrett replied, watching her excitement with pleasure. "We'll begin with a proper cabin bigger than your current one, with a bedroom and maybe a small study for your books. And a sturdy roof," Katie added with a smile. "The sturdiest in the territory," he promised, pulling her against him. "No storms getting through this one." True to his word, construction began as soon as the ground thawed enough to lay foundations. Katie finished the school term, then joined Garrett on their land full-time. They lived in a canvas tent while the cabin took shape, Katie cooking over an open fire and Garrett working alongside the 2 men he'd hired to help with the building. By midsummer, the cabin was habitable, a solid structure of pine logs with a shingled roof, reinforced to withstand Wyoming's fiercest weather. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture crafted by a cabinet maker in town, and Katie's books and treasures making it instantly home. "What do you think?" Garrett asked as they stood in the doorway of their new home for the first time. Katie surveyed the cabin with tears in her eyes. "It's everything I could have wished for." "Not everything," he corrected, guiding her hand to the door frame where he'd carved their names and wedding date. "Now it's everything." That night, sleeping in their new home for the first time, Katie shared news she'd been saving for this moment. "Garrett," she whispered in the darkness, "we're going to need that second bedroom sooner than we planned." He stilled beside her. "Katie, are you saying?" "Yes." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "By winter, there will be 3 of us." His whoop of joy echoed through the new cabin as he gathered her in his arms, his face alight with happiness. "A baby, our baby. Are you pleased?" she asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Pleased? Katie, I'm—" Words failed him, and he expressed his joy instead with passionate kisses that soon led to a celebration of their love and the new life they'd created. The following months were busy ones as they prepared both their home and their ranch for winter and the baby's arrival. Garrett built corrals, acquired a small herd of cattle and 2 milk cows, and constructed a barn sturdy enough to shelter their livestock through harsh weather. Katie planted a garden, preserved food for winter, and sewed tiny garments for their expected child. As her pregnancy progressed, Katie bloomed with health and happiness. Garrett watched her growing belly with wonder, often placing his hand against it to feel the baby's movements. "Strong, like its mother," he'd say proudly when a particularly vigorous kick made Katie wince. "Stubborn, like its father," she'd retort with a smile. Martha Henderson became Katie's closest confidante during this time, visiting often to share advice about childbirth and infant care. "You're doing marvelously," she assured Katie during one such visit in late October. "Though you should consider having someone stay with you as your time approaches. The journey to town is long if there's trouble." "I've delivered calves and foals," Garrett protested. "A baby can't be that different." Both women gave him such identical looks of amused exasperation that he raised his hands in surrender. "Fine, fine. I know when I'm outmatched." They agreed that Martha's niece, Sarah, who had experience as a midwife's assistant, would come stay with them in early December, a few weeks before Katie's expected confinement. November brought early snow, transforming their land into a white paradise. The cabin proved as warm and secure as Garrett had promised, the fireplace heating the main room perfectly while the bedroom stayed cozy under thick quilts. One evening, as they sat before the fire, Katie reading aloud from Dickens while Garrett carved a cradle for their child, a familiar sound interrupted their domestic peace, the howl of wind presaging a storm. "Sounds like a big one coming," Garrett observed, setting aside his carving tools. Katie marked her place in the book. "Should we check the livestock? I'll go. You stay warm." He kissed her forehead before bundling into his heavy coat and gloves. By the time he returned, the wind had increased dramatically, snow driving horizontally past their windows. "Animals are secure," he reported, stamping snow from his boots. "Added extra hay for warmth. This storm means business." Throughout the night, the blizzard intensified. Katie woke several times to the sound of wind battering their home, but unlike that first storm when they'd met, she felt no fear. The roof Garrett had built held firm, the walls standing solid against nature's assault. Dawn brought no relief, the storm continuing unabated. They remained indoors, grateful for their preparations, the stacked firewood, the stores of food, the lamp oil that let them read and work despite the darkness of the day. By evening, however, Katie began to feel strange pains different from the practice contractions she'd experienced in recent weeks. "Garrett," she said during a particularly sharp twinge, "I think the baby might be coming." His head snapped up from the bridle he was mending. "Now." "But it's too early. And Sarah isn't here." "The baby doesn't seem concerned with our plans," Katie replied, trying to keep her voice light despite her growing anxiety. Garrett was immediately in motion, stoking the fire, boiling water, and gathering clean linens. His face was calm, but Katie could see the fear behind his eyes, fear that matched her own. "We'll be fine," she assured him, though another pain made her gasp. Women have been having babies since Eve. Not my wife, he said grimly. Not my child. Not in a blizzard 20 miles from the nearest doctor. As the night progressed, Katie's labor intensified. Garrett stayed by her side, timing her pains, wiping her brow, and encouraging her with steady words that belied his inner turmoil. He'd read the medical book Martha had given them, but reading about childbirth and witnessing it were vastly different matters. Near midnight, as the storm reached new heights of fury, Katie's waters broke. The pains came faster then, more intense, leaving her gasping and clutching Garrett's hand with surprising strength. "I can't do this," she whispered during a brief respite between contractions. "You can," he replied fiercely. "You're the strongest person I know, Katie Blackwell." Stronger than any storm. Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, the wind finding every tiny crack in their home and howling its frustration at being denied entry. Inside, another force of nature was equally unstoppable. As dawn approached, Katie felt an overwhelming urge to push. Garrett positioned himself to help, his face set with determination that masked his terror. "I see the head," he announced after a particularly strong push. "Katie, you're doing it. One more big push." With a cry that rose above the storm's howl, Katie gave a final, mighty effort. Seconds later, a new sound joined the winds keening the indignant wail of their newborn child. "It's a boy," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the tiny, red-faced infant in a clean towel. "Katie, we have a son." He placed the baby on Katie's chest, where the child immediately quieted, seeming to recognize his mother's heartbeat. Katie stared in wonder at the perfect miniature features, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fists already curled with determination. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world." Garrett sat beside them, one arm around Katie's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's cheek. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Like his mother. What shall we call him?" Katie asked, looking up at her husband's awestruck face. Garrett considered the child, born amidst one of Wyoming's fiercest winter storms, yet already displaying the calm resilience that would serve him well in this rugged land. "Samuel," he suggested. "After my grandfather." "Samuel Robert Blackwell." "Samuel," Katie repeated, testing the name. The baby opened his eyes at the sound, revealing eyes that would likely darken to his father's green. "Yes, that's right, our Sam." By mid-morning, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving a world transformed by snow. Garrett ventured outside to check the animals and was relieved to find all had weathered the blizzard safely in the sturdy barn. When he returned to the cabin, he found Katie sleeping peacefully, their son cradled in her arms. The sight struck him with such powerful emotion that he had to lean against the doorframe for support. This was what he'd been working toward his entire adult life, not just land or cattle or a successful ranch, but this. Family, love, belonging. A home he'd built with his own hands, now filled with the people who made it truly his. 3 days later, when the trails were finally passable, Garrett rode to Panamint to send word to the Hendersons about Samuel's birth. He returned with Martha and Sarah, who had been frantic with worry when the storm prevented their planned arrival. "You did wonderfully," Martha assured Katie after examining both mother and baby. "Some women with a doctor and 3 midwives don't manage half so well." "I had Garrett," Katie replied simply, watching as her husband proudly showed their son to Sarah. "He held us together just like he promised." Spring came early that year, as if nature were making amends for the harsh winter. The land greened with remarkable speed, wildflowers carpeting the meadows and new leaves unfurling on the trees. Their small herd increased with the birth of calves. The garden Katie had planted the previous year came back stronger, and Samuel grew with astonishing rapidity. By the time he was 6 months old, Sam was sitting up, laughing at his father's antics and watching his mother with intelligent eyes that had indeed darkened to Garrett's shade of green. Katie had begun teaching him letters and numbers, reading to him daily from her collection of books. "He's too young to understand," Garrett pointed out one evening as he watched them. "Perhaps," Katie agreed, "but it's never too early to love learning." One afternoon in late summer, as Katie sat on a quilt in the shade of their cabin with Sam playing beside her, Garrett rode up with unusual excitement. "Got a surprise," he announced, helping her to her feet while being careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Come see." He led her to where their property adjoined public land, a stretch they'd often discussed acquiring if it ever became available. There, nestled in a protected hollow, stood a small building Katie had never seen before. "What is this?" she asked, puzzled. Garrett's eyes danced with suppressed excitement. "The land came up for auction last month. I bought it." "You did? But how?" "Been saving extra," he admitted. "Wanted it to be a surprise. And the building," he led her inside the simple structure with its large windows and rows of small desks. "Thought maybe come fall, the ranchers' children around here might need schooling. And I happen to know the best teacher in the territory." Katie turned in a slow circle, taking in the schoolroom he'd built for her, the blackboard mounted on one wall, the bookshelves waiting to be filled, even a small bell on the teacher's desk. "Garrett," she whispered, overcome with emotion, "you built me a school." "Built us a future," he corrected gently. "This land will support us well enough, but I know you miss teaching. Thought this might be the best of both worlds. You can teach. Sam can grow up with other children around, and we can still build our ranch." Katie threw her arms around him, unable to speak through her tears of joy. Garrett held her close, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Like it then?" he asked when she finally pulled back to look at him. "I love it," she assured him. "Almost as much as I love you." By September, word had spread about the new school, and 7 children from neighboring ranches began attending daily lessons with Mrs. Blackwell. Sam, not quite a year old, watched from a special corner Katie had created for him, already absorbing the rhythm of learning that would shape his life. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Garrett took Katie's hand. Happy, she leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her completely. "More than I ever imagined possible. Good, because I was thinking." "Dangerous pastime," she teased. "Sam might like a brother or sister." He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "When you're ready, of course." Katie's smile bloomed slowly, secretively. "I was thinking the same thing, though perhaps sooner than you expected." Garrett's eyes widened. "Katie, are you saying spring?" she confirmed, placing his hand over her stomach where new life was once again growing. Another spring baby for the Blackwells. His whoop of joy startled a nearby magpie into flight. "Does Sam know he's going to be a big brother?" "I tried telling him, but he seemed more interested in the grasshopper on the porch." Garrett laughed, then grew serious. "You're sure you're all right, teaching and caring for Sam, and now this?" "More than all right," she assured him. "I'm living the life I was meant for, Garrett. With the man I was meant to find." He kissed her then, tender and passionate at once. "Remember that first storm? When I said I'd hold the roof together with my body, how could I forget? It was the moment I began falling in love with you. I meant it literally then. But now—" He placed his hand over hers where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Now I understand what it really means to hold something together. This family, this life we've built. Together," Katie reminded him. "We hold it together." As night fell completely, bringing forth the stars they both loved, They remained on the porch, planning their future, cherishing their present, and marveling at how a single storm had set them on this path. Their daughter, Eleanor Martha Blackwell, arrived the following April on a day of gentle rain that promised abundant growth for the coming season. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry into the world, Ellie's birth was attended by both Martha and a proper doctor who had recently settled in Panamint. "Two of each now," Garrett commented years later as they watched 10-year-old Sam teaching 6-year-old Ellie, and 4-year-old Thomas how to ride their first pony while 2-year-old Grace toddled after them demanding her turn. "A perfect balance," Katie agreed, her hand finding his as it always did in moments of shared joy. The Blackwell Ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. The cattle herd now numbered over 300. Their horses were sought after throughout the territory, and Katie's school had grown to require an additional teacher, a young woman from Denver who boarded with them. The cabin had been expanded 3 times to accommodate their growing family, and now stood as one of the finest homes in the county, though Katie had insisted they preserve the original structure where they had weathered that first winter and welcomed Sam into the world. "Remember what you promised me when we married?" Katie asked, watching as Garrett lifted Grace onto his shoulders, the little girl's squeal of delight carrying across the yard. "That I'd build you a home so strong no storm could threaten it." He smiled down at her, the lines around his eyes deepening evidence of years spent squinting against Wyoming sun and wind. "You've kept that promise and more," she said softly. Garrett wrapped his free arm around her waist. "Best investment I ever made, holding up that roof all those years ago." "For both of us," Katie agreed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him before they went to join their children, their love as strong as the home they'd built together in the Wyoming wilderness.